sir.
We'll get us kicked off. I enjoyed it very much. You've told us of the origins of, I'm assuming, your politics, your love for the founding and the documents
Sure.
That are associated with it. From where do you get your ethics, morality?
Well, that's a tough one. I probably a lot of it is stuff I would say I don't recognize, at least, again, objectively. I think probably a lot of it came from my mom and from my grandparents. Certainly the way I was raised. I'm from central Kansas. I think I grew up with a pretty strong farming ethic. So that probably, if I have a good morality, it probably a lot comes from that. A lot comes from my own personal practices in my religious faith. I can't take a lot of credit for it. I think my wife keeps me in line quite often. So it's not, I realize you're asking a much deeper question than that. One of the things that I try to do, and I'm not doing this in the class that Nancy and Jane are in, but in another class I'm teaching over in the Honors College, which is great. Really, really nice students, fantastic students. And I'm teaching a course on the Western origin of ethics and the humanity of ethics. And I'm pretty happy arguing that most of our Western ethics come from Socrates and that there's a tradition that runs from that. And I think our founders, who were all liberally educated in the classics, every one of them, with only a few exceptions, so I shouldn't say everyone, but the vast majority of them had, by the time they were 14, they were fluent in Latin and Greek. And they're pretty amazing people. And they knew very well more. They knew Roman than they knew Greek. They knew Latin and they knew Greek, but they knew it, and their ethics came out of that. I think it's a pretty good mixture that we see among the American founders, at least, a good mixture of kind of Judeo-Christian and Greco-Roman pagan. Very good mixture. So I hope that helps. It's probably, I realize you were asking a deeper question than I'm answering, but I do think there's a long tradition there of that, one I buy into. Yes.
It wasn't a question, it's just a statement. If you and your wife ever want to go explore the fun that is shooting, just let us know. We'd be happy to take you.
We both grew up with a variety of guns, so thank you. I appreciate that.
We'd be happy to accompany you to the range. It'd be fun.
Thank you. That's great. That means a lot. Thanks.
Thanks for this talk. We really enjoyed it.
My pleasure.
Wanted to ask a little bit of a personal question. What can we do to support you, and what can we do to support conservatism in academia in general? Because it's such an important topic, and what can we do to support you and help you?
It's really interesting. I appreciate the question. There are a lot of things going on, especially with this program right now, that we're only here for a year, so we'll be transitioning out here in a little bit. And so there'll be a new person next year. And I know the president he's a really interesting guy. I don't know how many of you know Bruce Benson. I assume he's probably more powerful than the governor in a lot of ways, considering how much he controls. And if you've ever met him, and we've had the privilege twice to meet him, actually 3 times, just very briefly. I don't know him well, but my image of him is this. He's basically the guy who's standing next to John Wayne in some 50s Western. He's got a lot of personality, and he's very much in favor of this program. And he's pretty libertarian, actually, from what I can tell. He's got a strong conservative side, too, but especially on his own ethics and so forth. He's very libertarian. I think there are a lot of possibilities, and I'll leave this fairly hopeful. Trying to answer your question. I mean, there are things you can always do. Supporting someone, encouraging a student to read this or that. I highly, my class in the founding, I'm not teaching any secondary texts. Everything my students are reading is straight from the founders. Partly because the founders were really good. I mean, really, really, really good. They were great writers, and almost everything they wrote was for public consumption. There's nothing hidden. You don't have to read between the lines in the founding. These guys are straightforward. They know if they lose, they're going to die. They know that very clearly. They put their lives on the line a lot. John Dickinson's out fighting on the front lines. There are others as well who are out there fighting for what they believe, and I think they're right, believe very seriously to be their rights as well as their duties as men to do this. So I would always encourage that. But here's my hopeful note. Having been in academia now my whole adult life, which is good and bad, it's a great life. It's been a great profession. I've had a great time. Wonderful, actually. But it's interesting to me that when you meet, this was as true when I was in grad school in the 90s as it is now, the left is totally devoid of ideas. They have none. They really don't. I mean, there is nothing original coming out, except in the sciences, definitely. Engineering, but if you look at the left and the humanities, there's nothing at all. And the same is true in the social sciences. They have come down, I mean, essentially and this is true for a lot of neoconservatives as well, But they basically only understand power. Everything is power. They don't understand imagination. They don't understand creativity. And I think they would want to. It's not that they're willfully they just bought into a kind of, it's tapioca at best. I mean, it's just this kind of mediocre leftist line. There's a lot of mimicry. It's really, it's sad. I probably feel more sorry for them than anything else. Mostly because I don't think they're doing anything that interesting anymore. I mean, how many times have we heard race, class, and gender? It's become the holy trinity. And they're important issues, my gosh. They're critically important issues. But that's all you ever think about. You're missing humanity. You're missing everything, really. So there's not a lot of innovation going on. It's one reason I think Boulder's so fascinating, because you go to the physics department, these guys are doing really amazing things. They're doing the stuff that maybe Virgil did in terms of poetry. They're doing it in science. But they're not ideological at all. Yeah, they've got their little research method, and they're doing that. And it's good, and they're doing interesting things. But, you walk into the average lit program or history, it's just boring. They're losing students. There's a reason the humanities are dying as a discipline. I think that's really unfortunate, because the humanities, properly understood, are essential. But in the way they're doing it, they're just killing it, and it probably deserves to die. So I don't find, look at Obama. He doesn't propose anything interesting. Everything he does is a reworked policy proposal. That's it. No, but it's not, and it's unfortunately, it's true for a lot of politics. It's not just the Democrats. The Republicans are about as bad on this. But there's no, go back to a Daniel Webster, whether you agree with him or not, or John Adams. I would assume most of us would not have voted for John Adams. But, go back and look at what he's saying. He's doing really interesting things. Really interesting. And that's true. I assume, in this room, we probably have some division over Lincoln. But go read Lincoln. The guy could write. He could think. He was articulate. I would put him up against almost anybody today in politics in Congress. It's really a drastic change. And I think that's sad. But that's the state of things right now. And I think anyone who's creative, you've already automatically got an edge on almost everybody in D.C. So, thanks. Yeah, Brad.
Thank you for being here, Dr. Birzer.
Oh, my pleasure.
In your book, American Cicero, you bring up this issue, or this idea of democracy, and especially at a time when John Carroll, being a Catholic, was so concerned about his religious freedom. And you see what's happening in the world today, especially in Iraq, and with the lack of religious freedom and the issue with ISIS. And what do you think somebody like a Carroll would say to that? I'm curious, because you brought up about the idea of democracy.
Yeah, this is a really hard topic, because I think a lot of our textbooks, they generalize, especially the ones our kids, grade school kids are reading. And they almost always portray each of the colonies as giving religious freedom. If you're Anglican, you go here. And that was not the case at all. The colonies were dreadfully intolerant about anyone who wasn't them. So, if you're a Puritan, you can practice all you want in New England. But if you're a Baptist, you're dead, sometimes quite literally, right? One of the things I try and teach my students that I think is important is that one of the great benefits of colonial America is, and this is cheesy, but they usually don't forget this, it's this huge sea of tolerance with islands of intolerance. And you can basically jump from which intolerance you want to another intolerance if that first one didn't work out. What happens that's so dramatic, and no historian has accounted for this, none. No one has done this. There are a couple of things in the founding that have not been done yet. But you move from 1774, where almost every one of those laws is still on the books. Very hardcore. You can only be this, not that. And they'll list a whole bunch of things. And they're always punishments. And they're pretty severe punishments. And they give you a chance to recant. So if you're a Baptist, no one was more hated than the Baptists in colonial America. Even the Catholics got off better than the Baptists did. And that's saying a lot, really, in all kinds of ways. But you look at what happens. So 1774, all these laws are on the books. By 1776, no one is enforcing anywhere. They're all still there. And what happens when the revolutionary governments become the governments, that's the other thing no one's ever studied. You have this transition over 2 years, where essentially a group like this, and I'm not exaggerating, in Maryland in particular, you had a group of about 70 men who met in May of 1774. They met 9 times, and by about the 7th time, they declared themselves the legislature of Maryland. And they got away with it. And that happened everywhere. Really just people who were ticked off. And it just, you slide from royal government, or whatever you want to call it, to extra legal government, and it becomes legit. And during that transition, almost every law of religious intolerance was either wiped out or ignored. And so you move from a time, 2 years, where you have very strict restrictions on everybody, to nothing. That's amazing. Nowhere in the world do you see something like that. It just doesn't happen. And it doesn't mean there aren't problems. Right? There's still, in Boston, they're burning down the nunnery in 1833 after Lyman Beecher gives a rousing sermon saying you're not men unless that abbey is destroyed by tomorrow. And so, of course, they go take down the nuns. They were pretty fierce opposition. So it's gone within a day. They burn the whole thing down. But so you still see that, but there are exceptions. They're not the norm anymore. And people are pretty tolerant, and there's that spirit. And you see George Washington spends a huge amount of his first term just writing letters to the Hebrews, as he puts it, to the Hebrews of Rhode Island, to the Catholics of Maryland. And he stresses, you're fighting for the same thing. You believe in the liberty of the Republic. We're equals. That's amazing. Really just astounding. So I hope that answers you, Brad. But this is a scary time. And I'm going to pontificate because I'm a historian, not a foreign policy guy. But we've moved away from a world of ideologies, which were hell, all of them. Communism, fascism, National Socialism, just hell. We saw how many, they killed roughly 205 million people in the 20th century. We're moving away from that, but it's not gone. It's fusing with forms of fundamentalism. And that's maybe even more terrifying. At least when we were against the Soviets, we knew who was good and who was bad. I realize that's too simplistic, but sorry. Yes, I grew up near a Titan II missile base, right? Yeah. So, I know what that means. Red Dawn, who didn't want to be a Wolverine, right? Yes, thank you. Yes, Colorado. My best friend had a Firebird, a Camaro, and we actually had his trunk loaded with supplies in case, we got the 20-minute warning the missiles were coming. We knew we were heading out to eastern Colorado. We thought we'd be safe out there. We were going to join the Wolverines. So, yeah. We were both debaters. Obviously, this was some nerd fantasy. But anyway. Yes, sir, in the back. Yes, with the yellow. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. And again, one more thank you for the great talk.
My pleasure.
The prescience of the founders and the early patriots to realize the threat of liberty from democracy, from all the things that came true. What kind of other teeth could they have put in? What kind of legal? We had a 10th Amendment. What is there something they could have done to put more teeth into? No, you guys really don't want to do this.
They could have. There's a real, and this is good and bad, right? And I'm drawing on the work of a friend of mine, Bruce Fronin, really great legal theorist and historian. Teaches in Ohio now at a law school there. He's done a lot of work looking at what happens with the notions of community. And I think we have to be clear, when the founders talk about the common good and the res publica, the republic, they don't mean that in the sense a modern day socialist meant it. They meant that we volunteer to come together as a community and we protect one another. And we choose to do that. And that, we look at what happens on April 19th of 1775 at Lexington, Massachusetts. It's an entire community that just, after hours of debate, Marines are coming, British Marines, not called Marines yet, but they're coming, 600 of them. What do we do? And they debate this. It's a serious issue. Do we parade our arms or not? So you get and even all the way up to the Civil War. For any of us who studied the Civil War, the first 2 years of the war are utterly chaotic. And part of that is because there's no uniform standard. Where we teach at Hillsdale, 500, actually it was 492 of 500 men volunteered on day one. And of course, what do they do when they go into battle? They wear the Hillsdale colors. That's why, if any of you've ever read about First Bull Run, there are guys there in French red Moroccan silk. Not the best thing to wear on a modern battlefield. You've got Swedes from New York who are dressed up in blue and yellow. It's chaos. And part of that's that community tradition. When you fight, of course you fight with your neighbor Joe. Of course you know his mom. Of course you went to church with them. It's all community. Now, what happens, you join the Marines, chances are good you're not going to be with the guy from Lafayette. They're going to put you with the guy from the Bronx and the guy from East St. Louis. And of course, part of that is they're making you a Marine. Whereas in the 18th and 19th century, you fought because you were a member of that community. And your community decided to side with this community and this community against those communities. And that, the first 2 years of the Civil War is nothing but a history of a variety of communities fighting a whole variety of other communities. And that, it's not until the Gettysburg Address in 1963 that everything becomes ready. The draft, first time, goes into effect. 94% of Union soldiers were volunteers. 100% up until 1863. This is what they believed in. It was very important to them. So that community organization was there. But we also see, and this is where I'm relying on the work of my friend Bruce, what he says is, imagine what happens with the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Federalists who wanted to give serious teeth to the federal government, and the Anti-Federalists who wanted it to remain with local, small communities. Well, they have to compromise. Neither side can really win. And so the Federalists get their Constitution, and we have to admit, whatever its flaws, it's pretty good. It's got its flaws, right? Slavery is obviously the largest one. It's got other flaws as well. And what do the Anti-Federalists demand? A Bill of Rights. And they work it out. They don't even create political parties based on it. They have sides, Federalists and Anti-Federalists. They don't create parties. They work together. And part of Bruce's argument about this is that this is a non-ideological age. They recognize that they have to work together if this thing is going to work. So part of it, I think we get frustrated because we look back and we say, why'd you compromise on that? Why would you give in on that? Why not keep? Look at the Northwest Ordinance. I only read 2 parts of it. Part 6 says there can be no slavery in the territories. And I'm thinking, my God, please, why didn't you do that? Right? I mean, wouldn't that have...
Why Dred Scott was fought?
Yes, well, up in Minnesota.
And claimed that...
That's right, the Northwest Ordinance applied to him, but he was on the wrong side of the river. Right? If he had been a few feet on the other side, well, a few feet, right? Mississippi's a little wider than that. If he'd been on the other side, he would have been okay. Right? And I mean, it's a fascinating thing. What do you do with that? So, here you have this idea, you have this ability, you have this belief that you can make this thing happen and be free, but they have to compromise too. And I'm not arguing that should be our model, but I do think it's fascinating to know they had to work this out. So certain things they gave way that I wish they wouldn't have. But they did. So I hope that helps. I'm not totally answering you, but maybe thank you. Jane.
In thinking about your discussion about religious tolerance and how that came about, and it was based on a lack of enforcement of the rules.
Yes, that were there and then faded out.
So, just as a devil's advocate, why is it any different than how Obama is handling immigration today? Saying, well, the ends justifies the means. And on what basis do we think it was okay in one situation, and now we can say, well, this is really, he's not following rule of law, and I'm not advocating for Obama.
No, sure. Well, immigration's a tough issue.
Right. Oh wow! How do you defend one and not?
I think it's more, and this is probably a cheat, and I'll fall back on reading Friedrich Hayek, but I think it's more that one emerged out of conflict, the others being directed from above. So it's more that these people realized in their common struggle that it was ridiculous to worry about sectarian differences when they have a common enemy. They're trying to make the republic work. That's a lot different than any president, regardless, Republican, Democrat, imposing something by executive order and kind of sidestepping the process as it develops. But I mean, I would assume even in this room where we're probably fairly like-minded on immigration, we could have some serious debates about how that plays out. So I mean, that's a huge issue for everyone who's not, well, I think it's probably for the left too. But, that's, I think, on the right, especially libertarians, conservatives, it's a hard issue. I mean, I've got my opinions, but there are opinions.
In fact, I was
just really only comparing process.
Oh, no, that's
not really
absolutely. But I do think it's more. And the other thing is, this is something that I think the founders were fairly clear on, and Washington was as well. The legislature has the power. That the legislature makes the laws. The job of the president is only to enforce those laws. And that, since Jackson, I mean, that's gone by the wayside, progressively for a very long time. But, there's a reason we remember Daniel Webster, Clay, and Calhoun, and we remember them as equals to Andrew Jackson. Yeah, we wouldn't say that with whoever the best senator is right now. And 100 years from now, if we're talking about history, they're going to focus more on Obama than on McCain. Yeah, and I'm just throwing that off. But we don't take that seriously anymore. The legislature, and we know it's kind of there are problems with it, right? And they've given over their power pretty easily, so they've handed it away. So I hope that helps.
So
yeah,
we'll go to Wendy and then I'll.
Sure, that's great. And you guys stop me whenever. I don't want to.
No, we don't want to stop you.
They always shut us down too early.
Thank you for a fantastic and fact-filled yet succinct presentation. Thank you. The quote that you ended with your opening, the quirky one.
Oh, from Fisher Ames? The one about liberty?
Yes.
Yes.
I had never heard that before. That's fantastic. If you could make that available to Liberty on the Rocks Facebook
Oh,
page.
you know what? I've got it on. Yeah, absolutely. I've got it on my iPad, so I can't. But I'll send it to you.
That.
Yeah, that's a fun quote. Yeah.
And I'm also curious. You were born and raised in Kansas.
Yeah.
Do you consider Kansas part of the West?
I grew up with quarter horses and a farm. So, yes, I grew up writing, and I actually was born on the 98th meridian. So
you can be over here.
yeah, it is funny because people in Kansas City see themselves as Midwestern, but anyone west of Wichita sees themselves as a Westerner. But I know Coloradans would really think that. And when I say that to my students from California, they just laugh. They say, yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. I was Central, yes, not Mountain. Mountain doesn't change until you're in. Is it Western Kansas? That's right, that's Slice. Yep, okay. Yeah. So I hope that answers you.
Yeah.
That was the tough one of the night. Thank you.
I'm glad I'm here.
Yeah, thanks. Good. Yes.
So 2 questions. The first one kind of a bit shorter because it got asked of Dr. Hayward last year.
Sure.
If there were 5 books that you would say that, obviously I think de Tocqueville is one of them, but 5 books that every American should read. What do you? Any American that specifically is concerned about liberty, what would those books be?
Well, anything, if you could get a compilation of the founding documents, so Federalist, Anti-Federalist, all the various laws that were passed, some of the debates, the Madison debates, the debates that he wrote about, the 2 volumes they weren't published till 20 years after, but of the convention, are brutal, insightful. You get the Federalist papers, they're so sanitized because they're newspaper editorials. But when you see these guys really fighting, and especially about issues like slavery, which they took about 3 weeks, and it got very personal, as you can imagine, it was astounding to see that. And they make choices. I think, going back to your question, I think they made poor choices, but who am I? I mean, I wasn't there. And I've grown up I've had a pretty easy life. I wasn't fighting the British So I would say if you can get a compilation of the founding documents. I definitely de Tocqueville, no question about that. I think de Tocqueville would be perfect for that, especially as we're trying to. But I would go a little deeper too. I would say that anything from Cicero, because he was so influential on the founders. I would say that probably the Aeneid by Virgil, because again, one of the critical texts for the founders, when they had memorized that, was part of their college entrance exam. They had to translate the first 3 books of the Aeneid from Latin into Greek and then into English to even be considered for college. And that was at age 14, right? So, I mean, that was very, very, very important. I don't know what a recent one. I'd have to think about a modern one. So I'm only giving you 3, right? But well, I should know. I mean, as a historian, I should be able to whip those out. But yeah, I'd probably pick something, about rock or something. So it probably wouldn't be that.
The second question would be, you kind of actually hinted on it for a second ago when you were talking about Clay and Calhoun.
Yeah.
Why do you think, obviously, when we look back at our own heritage, we have these great statesmen that were legislators, not necessarily presidents. Now, most of these people are a joke. I mean, frankly.
Yeah.
So what happened, and how can we recapture that type of? I mean, these men were great philosophic thinkers, and now
Yes, they were. Whether we agreed with them or not, I mean, they were amazing. There were a lot of things that changed. The biggest thing I would say is education changed profoundly. If we, up until the 1870s, all education was Latin and Greek. You were expected to do reading, writing, and arithmetic at home. You wouldn't waste school time on that. So there was a culture of that. And of course, you learned your English generally because they were very Protestant. You learned your English from the King James Bible, and that was taught by your father. And the oral part obviously was taught by your mother, the mother tongue, but your father is the one who taught you how to read. Those are so dated now. So many people don't even grow up with two parents. So how would you do that when you're talking about a time that was so essential to who and what they are? So you get this, everybody was liberally educated, and they had a common language. Their language was Greece and Rome. Now that's really important that they could, so pick up any Daniel Webster speech, all kinds of references to every classical figure you can imagine, and everybody knew it. They knew that. So I think there was a tradition of oratory that went with that, very important. Even a Lincoln who's not formally educated, but picks that up and has such a great, at least in his writing. Again, whether we agree with him or not, the guy could write. It was amazing at that. But the other thing that changes, and this is where the founders really did mess up, they just got this wrong. They thought that every branch of government would be so jealous of its power that it would never even dream of handing over any of its responsibilities to another branch. They would be that protective. And we saw it. You've got Jackson, and then you've got Lincoln, strong executives. But they're gone. Almost every single law that's passed under Lincoln is repealed, with the exception of the Secret Service Act. Everything else is repealed eventually. Income tax, greenback laws, everything. So I'm not saying what he did was good, but it was a temporary measure, clearly. And after the war, everything went back to normal. But then you get to Woodrow Wilson. And from there, you have Wilson, and then you have some soft presidents, meaning they're not enforcing their will on everybody. Harding and Coolidge. And then, of course, you get Hoover, who's very strong. And then you get FDR, and then you get Truman, and then Eisenhower, who's not as strong, interestingly enough, but still compared to a 19th century president. So we have this whole tradition now dating back to Woodrow Wilson that the executive has immense power. And for me, and I'm sure again, this is my opinion, and I'm speaking just as a fellow American citizen, but the one point Congress had the power, I think, to really rise up and do something and take its power back was when Obama, from the beaches of Brazil, ordered the air cordon around Libya. So anybody in Congress, Rand Paul, anybody could have stood up and they could have asserted congressional authority over that. They didn't. It just went by. It was just one of those moments. And we haven't been in a constitutional war since 1945. It doesn't mean what we've done in Vietnam or Korea is not just, but it's not constitutional at all. And that, I think, matters a lot. So just one last thing, and I find this fascinating too. When we look at the founding, and we skip this quite often, it's quite clear in Article 1 that the Army, any appropriations for the Army, any law dealing with the Army can only exist for 2 years total. You can renew it at the end of 2 years, but always there's that 2-year limit. We almost completely, we have a standing Army now. And I'm not knocking our military. I think they do some very good things, and they're probably pretty good people overall. But that's a different tradition. That's not the founding tradition. That's a very modern tradition. So, hope that helps. Yeah. Thanks for letting me in on such a dour note.
Thank you so much. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Birzer, for sharing your thoughts.